We're speaking tonight, as the title suggests, about Jesus and man, myth, or Messiah. So I want us to start, first of all, by looking at what we would call the great question, right? The greatest question of history. And this is a question that Jesus himself actually, it's recorded in the Bible as a question that he asked his followers. And he, at one point, after having spent some time with them, said, "Who do you say that I am?" And whoever you are, wherever you come from, and whatever your background is, all of us in this room, and even those listening on the YouTube channel, everyone, or even those that would watch this message later on, we all have an opinion and a perspective, or perhaps a conviction of who Jesus Christ actually is. And so this is really answering the greatest question in history. Now, you may not be convinced right now that this is the greatest question to ask, but I hope that by the time I'm finished that you might be a little bit more persuaded of why this question is so important. And this is referencing from the Bible and from one of the Gospels called Matthew, and Matthew 16, verse 15. But you might be here tonight and you might be skeptical even of the reliability of the Bible. And look, that's not the nature of the topic tonight, but I will be touching on now and again just on the credibility of the Bible as a book and evidence for the Bible, in fact, being a supernatural book. And that's not going to be the primary focus. For now, that is something you could explore in your own time, and I'd encourage you to do so if you're not convinced that the Bible is a supernatural book or that it is reliable as a book that we can depend on in terms of how it ties into history, archaeology, or more importantly, philosophy and theology. So, but the important thing here, before we get into answering the question about whether Jesus was just a man or even was a man, whether he's merely a myth, like a fairy tale, or whether he was actually the Messiah, meaning he is God and he's our Savior, what we need to consider, first of all, is the nature of faith. And many would say that faith is believing what you know is not true. And so I just first want to clear up what faith actually is, because if we are convinced that real faith is in fact believing something that isn't true, and in other words, the more sort of absurd it is, or the more ridiculous something is, the more you believe it, the bigger your faith is. Right? Some people have that idea. And it goes back from hundreds of years ago when, before the Enlightenment, before we had more developed rational thinking and science as part of the Enlightenment, before that time, the way that people thought of reality, what we saw, what we felt, what we experienced, that there were too many things that we couldn't explain, like lightning and disease. And so the idea was, well, wherever we couldn't explain something, well, then we would just put God into that gap. We would put God into the gaps of what we cannot explain. And that is what we would call blind faith. And so the first thing I actually want us to look at tonight is whether believing in Jesus is in fact merely blind faith. Is that really what it is? Is that what the Bible, whatever you might think, whether you think the Bible is just a bunch of stories and it isn't actually factual and literal in any way or form, or whatever you might think of it, I do want to clarify the kind of faith that the Bible does actually promote and expect, and as such, Jesus. And so the first thing I want to consider is believing in Jesus like believing in fairy tales, or more specifically, is it like believing in Father Christmas? Right, here we have Father Christmas. So, if you've seen children who really are convinced that Father Christmas is real, then you'll know that it makes them very happy, right? And so sometimes we think of believing in Jesus as something, well, as long as it makes you happy, well, that's okay. It doesn't matter whether it is true, and it doesn't matter whether Jesus really was a real human being, or for that matter, whether Jesus was God. As long as it makes people happy, well, that's okay for them. And so I want to consider whether that really is the case, and whether blind faith is really the faith of the Bible. Now, let me start by telling you a story. A number of years ago, I was on the plane, and I was flying from Johannesburg to Cape Town, And there was a man sitting next to me, and I got into conversation with him. And so as we're talking, he's busy kind of itching and scratching a rather lot, and tells me that he's actually flying to Cape Town to go see a skin specialist, a dermatologist. And then as we get talking, we got into the topic of God. And so I told him that, that I'm a Christian. I believe that God is real. And so it turns out that this man is a very intellectual atheist. In fact, he was not only a professor, he was on the board of higher education for South Africa. So, he was kind of like the highest ranking sort of intellectual sphere in our context, if that makes sense. So we get into a conversation about God, and as we're busy talking about God and the nature of the reality of the universe, and I shared with him that my wife, she's a graduate of King's College London and studied biology. She's a scientist, and that she believes in God. And he was like, no, that's ridiculous. And he kept making this statement throughout our conversation. He kept saying, I am not a person of faith. I am a person of science and reason. As if these are two separate things, like oil and water. They just can't mix. It's either you believe in God or you believe in science and reason. And, and so he made the statement a few times. And so I put a scenario to him, and I said to him, well, this kind of skin disease you've got. And I asked him, I said, imagine somebody comes to you, prays for you in the name of Jesus, and as they pray for you, instantly you get healed completely of the skin disease that you've had maybe for years. And then I tried to be really kind and lower the bar so low so that he could very easily just kind of maybe, subscribe to this. And I said to him, would you maybe consider that it's just possible that miraculous healing could be evidence for God's existence? So I didn't even ask if this could be proof. This was just simply, could it be evidence that just maybe, possibly, could be evidence for God's existence? You know what he said to me? He said, absolutely not. He said, because science will have an explanation. And so at that point, we continued the conversation, and then a little bit later, he made the statement again, and he said, I'm not a person of faith. I'm a person of science and reason. At which point I stopped him and I said, actually, that's not true. So he was like, what do you mean? I said, well, when I told you that, I asked if somebody prayed for you and you would get instantly healed, and you said, well, science would have an explanation for that. I said, you just demonstrated faith in science. He was so surprised. His jaw dropped, and he was honest enough to say, I realize that you are right. And suddenly he realized that the lines between reason and faith are actually more blurred than he initially realized. And not only that, I then began to explain to him how it is that there is evidence for God's existence. That we don't have to believe in God blindly, like believing that Thor is the god of lightning, and every time you see a lightning strike, well, that's because Thor is angry. And so he's, and that's how we explain lightning. I said that just like we can examine the evidence of our reality, there are ways and there are criteria by which we can examine the existence of Jesus Christ, the credibility of the Bible, and that's the kind of faith that we want to speak about. So, but however, I want to just point a few things out. So number one is that we're not talking about blind faith. But equally, one thing we need to realize is that there are some who do subscribe to faith, and the way that they express their faith and believe and hold on to their faith is blind faith. So I'm not saying that nobody doesn't use blind faith, that there are people who have subscribed to a belief in God, whatever God, whether it's God of the Bible or Islam or whatever, and where they are not concerned at all about whether there's evidence or not. However, what I want to point out to you is that the narrative or the story of the Bible is that there is a God who created everything, but he created the universe for a purpose, and the primary purpose for which he created the universe was actually to have relationship with us. Now, if that is true, do you think that God would not leave any evidence for us to be able to find him? If that is true, then we should expect to find, like in a crime scene, we should expect to find fingerprints, perhaps some footprints, maybe some signposts that God has left so that we can find him and discover that he is real. And later on, we'll even look at, well, why? Why would God not just make himself more obvious? And we'll touch on that very briefly. Why is it that he's left fingerprints and footprints as evidence to discover him and there's a very good explanation for that. But what I want to outline for us is that equally, just as we get blind faith, and there are those who subscribe to blind faith, and what I'm trying to convey to you tonight is that the faith of the Bible is not blind faith. What I want to also point out, though, and what perhaps some have not considered, is that there is such a thing as blind unbelief. So like my friend on the plane, he was so, if you like, committed that there is no God, that's unbelief, that there is no God that created the universe, that he blindly believed that, so much so that even in the face of possible evidence of God's existence through a miracle, that he just wouldn't even consider it. He would not open his mind to the possibility. That is not very scientific. Do you see that? That is not a very scientific approach. A true scientist will be willing to follow the evidence wherever it points to. And that's what we want to encourage you to do here tonight. And so I want to point out to you, Thomas Nagel, the philosopher, said the following. And he was an atheist philosopher. And he said, it isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. So why would someone not want God to exist? Well, let me ask you this question. So I presume all of us at some point were at school. And what happens in the classroom if the school teacher happens to leave for an extended period of time? Can anybody tell me? What begins to happen? The teacher leaves the classroom. Kids are unsupervised. What happens? All right, we've got a picture just in case you... all right. Isn't this what happens? All right. So we begin to just behave without rules. There's no teacher, there's no authority, no one to check up to see whether we're obeying the rules or not. So the reality is, for us, there's an element where we might think that having no authority means there are no rules. Then we can just do whatever we want to do. Which is fine, as long as you are the bully in the class, right? But the trouble is, if there's no authority, well then what we are left with is that might is right and the strongest determine the rules. And we just have to look at Europe, 60-odd years ago, 60, 70 years ago, to know that that is not a great reality to be in. Do you know what I'm talking about? And so, but nonetheless, as much as we might wish for there to be an authority that can bring order, that can also bring hope and bring restoration, then just because we wish for it to be true doesn't mean that it is true. But just perhaps there is a creator that intended for this whole universe and our existence to have a purpose. And that purpose is for a relationship with him. And he has left sufficient evidence to support that. So let's look at how we can then begin to do that. So what I'm ultimately speaking about is that also that what we need is not absolute faith. But what we do need is adequate faith. And so there's a reason for that. And the reason why I say adequate faith rather than absolute faith is because if the story is true, if the Bible is true, then it means that God is an uncreated, eternal being, and that there is a reality beyond this universe, this time and space continuum, this material universe we find ourselves in. It means that there is a reality beyond this reality. And this reality has been put in place by an eternal, uncreated, intelligent being. And so here we are with our finite minds trying to grasp and understand infinite realities. So therefore, it should be logical to expect that there should be some stuff that we do not yet understand and that are beyond our comprehension. Just as you wouldn't expect a primary school child, typical primary school child, I'm not talking about some prodigy, I'm talking about a typical primary school child to understand master's level mathematics. It would be unkind to do so. So in the same way, there are realities beyond our comprehension if there is an infinite, eternal reality, a spirit realm beyond this existence. Does that make sense? All right, so let us see, therefore, how we can, at the very least, pursue an adequate faith rather than an absolute faith. And so to understand the adequate faith that I'm talking about, I want you to consider a court of law. And then once we understand this, we can now begin to examine just the three questions of whether Jesus Christ was a man, whether he was a myth, or whether he was a Messiah. So in the courts of law, you have a judge or a jury that are expected to pass a verdict on a certain situation. There may be an accused and an accuser concerning a scenario, or perhaps a suspect. And so what let's say it's the judge, what the judge does is that the judge will send for witnesses, for evidence to be presented to the court. And as the evidence is examined, and there's cross-examination that's also part of the process to try and look at all the evidences, weigh up the credibility of the evidence. And in the process, the intention is that with more data that is collected and gathered, that eventually we should get sufficient perspective so that eventually a verdict can be passed. And that verdict, that point at which we weigh up the evidence and look at where the evidence points, then and the verdict is passed, that is what faith is like. That is what we're talking about. We are saying examine the evidence, look at where the evidence points, and then draw the conclusion and make a decision. And at the end of my talk tonight, I'm going to finish off by looking at the significance of this claim of Jesus Christ, whether or not he is a Messiah, and what is in the balance for every one of us and the choice before us. And then it will be up to each one of us to choose and to decide who do we say that Jesus is and what we're going to do about it. All right. So you're following me in terms of where we're going. So that's what we're talking about. Now, so in terms of the faith of the Bible, our pursuit is the following. It is to explore if there is enough evidence from what we can know to have faith for what we are, right? For what we can't know. Sorry, that's what it should say. So to explore if there's enough evidence from what we can know to have faith for what we are not capable of knowing. You with me? So that's what we want to specifically look at. Now let's quickly look at the faith of the Bible. And so I want to look at specifically, one of the writers is a guy called Luke. He wrote one of the Gospels and specifically the accounts of the life of Jesus. And he is considered one of the greatest historians of his time. So just because it's included in the Bible, as long as we're not exercising our absolute unbelief, then at least be open that even the writers of the Bible can also be measured by the criteria of credible historians. We should not dismiss the Bible writers as valid historians until we've at least given them a chance to be weighed up in the court of law. And so Luke has been examined as such, and he was in fact a medical doctor. And as a medical doctor, he was trained in looking at the senses, looking at predictability, just as we do in science. And he applies that to the narrative or the story and the person of Jesus Christ. And so here in Luke chapter 1, verse 1 to 4, we read the following. And he's writing to a friend of his, and he says, inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, speaking specifically about the events of Jesus and his life. He says, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses. So he was concerned, like in a court of law, about the eyewitness accounts of these events. And he says, and ministers of the word delivered them to us. And then if we continue, it seemed good to me also. And this is now given his way of thinking, his approach, his attention to detail. He says, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed. This is not expecting to believe just because you are told. He is presenting the evidence. He's presenting the eyewitness accounts. On another account, there's 1 John chapter 1, verse 1 to 4. And here, and again, we are looking at what is the nature of faith that the Bible expects. And so this is the nature of it here. It says, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard. Again, this is speaking about the life of Jesus, right? As man, myth, or Messiah. It says, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled. Notice those highlighted words. These are speaking about the senses. It's speaking about using our ears and our eyes and our hands. And he says, concerning the word of life, the life was manifested, and we have seen and bear witness. Again, like the evidence of the court of law, and declare to you that eternal life, which was with the Father and was manifested to us. And then if we go on, that which we have seen and heard, notice how many times it's emphasizing the senses as part of the process for faith. It says that which we have seen and heard, we declare to you, that you also may have fellowship with us. And truly, our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. And so this is actually promoting, because of what is known, and this was written and not long after. It was within a couple of decades of Jesus' life, within just a few decades, that these accounts were recorded and were made known publicly and made available for scrutiny and could be discredited at the time when still there were people alive to actually be able to discredit these writings and these claims. But the motivation is so that we may have fellowship, so that we may know. And notice he speaks in the present tense. He's speaking of Jesus as someone still alive, someone still knowable. And that's important to note. And these things we write to you. And here is an amazing statement, that your joy may be full. Now, I don't know what your experience is of Christianity, of the faith, or of church. But maybe for some of you, it hasn't been a very positive experience. But certainly, what the Bible describes as what faith produces is joy. It's peace. It's wholeness. It's the God of the Creator able to step in. And where there's brokenness, the God of the Creator is able to step in and is able to bring wholeness, restoration, and healing. The God of restoration is able to step in and provide purpose and direction, meaning, and contentment to our lives. And this is why this is so important and so significant to examine. So what I want to outline is that the faith we're speaking about is not speaking about religion. And we need to separate those two concepts. Religion, where it involves rituals and following rules. But what we're actually talking about here is relationship. We're talking about relationship with God as Creator. We're talking about spiritual, rational, relational belief in a Creator who loves us, created us, and has a plan and purpose for us. Now, I'm going to be looking, as we look at Man, Myth, or Messiah, we have a book, and this is a book written by Dr. Rice Brooks, and he has specifically outlined and written this book as he has examined the evidences from leading experts in the fields of study concerning the biblical accounts, as well as specifically the New Testament writings and the person of Jesus Christ. And so he has put together a book and compiled and laid it out, specifically the evidences that can be examined. And I'm mentioning that up front right now before we jump into Man, Myth, or Messiah, so that as we do so, if what I've said tonight is not enough, and I don't expect it will be, I can't expect in the short time we have together to cover all the details relating to this person and to this incredible message. But I want to at least affirm you and highlight that there's this book specifically, and there are many other books like it, and many other intelligent writers, rational thinkers, who have compiled and put together ways in which we can process and answer this question, because this question is so important. So before we continue, I want to show you a video, and this gives us a moment to pause, a moment to break, and to watch a video. And this kind of captures just some of the key points to note as we now jump into looking at whether Jesus Christ was a man, or a person in history, a historical figure, whether he was a myth made up like Father Christmas, or like the Greek gods like Thor, or was Jesus truly Messiah, God who came into this world to save us. So let's watch this video before we go ahead.
Dude.
Hey, what's up?
What you reading?
The Bible.
You're reading the Bible?
Yeah.
Dude, why are you reading the Bible? For class?
No, I just...
Okay, so you're just reading the Bible. You're just sitting here in a coffee shop in the 21st century using state-of-the-art technology to read ancient myths for no reason whatsoever.
Well...
Tell me something. Are you one of those super religious people who thinks Jesus actually rose from the dead?
Well, I do believe that.
Do you also believe in the Easter Bunny, Santa Claus, unicorns, Bigfoot? Ever been abducted by aliens? And do you buy into all those other ancient myths about dying and rising gods invented by primitive nomadic tribes back in the Bronze Age?
No.
Okay, so what's the difference between Jesus rising from the dead and all those other fairy tales?
Here's the difference. My belief in the resurrection of Jesus is rational. It's based on historical facts.
Facts? What facts?
Well, first, Jesus died by crucifixion.
Whoa, hold on. We don't even know if Jesus existed. Why should I believe your facts?
Well, because the 5 facts I'm going to give you are backed by so much historical evidence that most professional critical scholars who study the subject accept them as true. That includes skeptical atheist scholars.
Okay, so Jesus was a guy who actually existed and then got himself killed. So what?
That's the first fact. Second, his disciples were convinced that he rose from the dead and appeared to them. Third, Paul, a sworn enemy of the early Christians, suddenly became a Christian. Fourth, Jesus' skeptical brother James also became a Christian. And fifth, the tomb where they put Jesus' body was empty.
And those are well-established historical facts.
Right, but you can't just leave it there. These facts demand an explanation. Otherwise, you've got a big hole in human history.
Okay, here's an explanation. They all lied. It was a conspiracy, the most monumental prank ever perpetrated. His followers stole his corpse from the tomb and then started telling everybody he was alive.
That's the conspiracy theory. The problem is it doesn't explain the facts. How do a few spineless fishermen, cringing in fear for their lives, subdue a bunch of well-armed, professional Roman guards, roll away a 2-ton stone, steal a body, then hide it from a city swarming with people trying to find it? And why would they do it? The disciples had absolutely nothing to gain by lying about Jesus' resurrection. In fact, they were persecuted, and we have good historical evidence that 5 of them were martyred because of their claim that Jesus rose from the dead. Apparently not a single one of them ever recanted. People don't willingly die for something they know isn't true. They were there. They knew whether it was true or not.
All right, another theory. The disciples thought they saw Jesus alive after he died, but it was just wishful thinking. They were stressed and just kind of hallucinated.
The hallucination theory also lacks explanatory power. 500 witnesses saw Jesus at the same time, and the disciples touched him. Psychologists have shown that hallucinations don't work like that, nor does this explain the empty tomb.
Okay, look, maybe there's some other explanation, but the bottom line is dead people stay dead. Rising from the dead would be a supernatural event, a miracle, and science has proven that miracles don't happen.
Oh, really? When did that happen?
I don't know. I just kind of heard it somewhere.
Science has not disproven miracles. In fact, that would be impossible.
Why?
Science deals exclusively with natural phenomena, physical matter and material processes, right?
Yeah.
But a miracle, by definition, is not a natural phenomenon. It's supernatural.
So
a supernatural event would lie outside the boundaries of science. It's logically impossible for science to throw out any hypothesis that lies outside its boundaries.
Why have I never heard this stuff before?
I don't know. Maybe because it's scary?
Scary?
Yeah. As long as Jesus rising from the dead is just a fairy tale, like Santa Claus and unicorns, it doesn't threaten my little world. But if it's a fact, if he actually did rise from the dead, that's huge. It's a total game changer. And that's why it's so hard to think about it objectively.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Big whoa.